So at this moment, because we made a little switch between Professor Yamaguchi and Professor Keen, we will go on with Professor Keen, and I'll just do a little introduction. Well, the first statement is pretty good there. Dr. Keen is widely regarded as one of the world's most accurate analytical economists. Actually received an award for warning the world for the 2008 financial crisis. And his warning was based on using an economic modeling system, an advanced economic modeling system called Minsky. And many of us know about Minsky, and we'll probably hear about him more. He has been asked to do briefings for Washington, actually giving them the tools to maybe avoiding the next fiscal cliff and not get into another, great depression. So far, we're not in a Great Depression, but I think with the COVID and whatever else is going on, I got a feeling, there's trouble on the horizon. For today, Professor King will do a presentation titled One Mathematical Model of Modern Monetary Operations. So we know he has been working on modeling like Yamaguchi and like other people. And the title almost suggests that the model is exhaustive and that you got all elements and all relationships lined up and can tell us what's going to happen in the future. And probably you put in COVID also as one of the elements. Anyway, Professor King, nice to see you. Good to see you. Thanks for joining. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay, it's coming through. I've just haven't checked that I've been unmuted, haven't I? Okay, pardon me having a few too many windows open here. I'll shut down Chrome for the meantime. So that was very impressive work by Karu, and as you say, he's one of the foremost modelers in system dynamics, and certainly one of the very few to model money. Certainly the most comprehensive modeling I've seen, and I love the empirical work you've just shown, Karu. I've been, as well as working on modeling money, I've been working on a tool to model money, and that's called Minsky, as we discussed a moment ago. So I want to quickly show Minsky because one of the difficulties about the software that Karu uses is it really takes quite a bit of time to develop the skills to know how to lay out a Vensim model or any of the other Vensim, Stellar, I think, Simulink, they're all the various system dynamics programs. And what I wanted to do was to have something which was understandable for an ordinary user in terms of showing how the money system operates. So what Minsky does is it does have the the flowchart methodology as well, which is common for all the other system dynamics programs, and I'll show that in a moment. What it has which is unique, is the capacity to use double entry bookkeeping to build models of an economy. So I'll just quickly show you the basics of doing that. Minsky is open source, it's free. You can download it from SourceForge or GitHub, which are the two repositories of open source software that are used around the world. And what I want to just quickly put a very fast little model together. So when you look at the world in a double entry bookkeeping way, and this is looking at for your financial commitments, your assets, your liabilities and equity, where they are, where an asset for you is a liability for somebody else. So there are some things, if you bought your car outright, that's an asset of yours, not a liability of anybody else's. So that stuff is not included, but this is looking at how to build a model of the claims that you have on somebody else and somebody else has on you and what the dynamics therefore are of money. So I'm just going to create an asset here called reserves. Oh great, and this is, I'm just using the latest version of the software. I should be very careful about this. We have a bug. Oh great. Let's let this crash and I'll bring up a previous version. One of the wonders of...
Dave, we don't see, it's like not PowerPoint or it's not presentation mode. We see a lot of your screen, I think.
Yeah, it's seeing the entire screen here.
Yeah, okay.
Is it
Just wanted to
possible to
make
read it? Is it read it at your level?
No, it's very small.
Oh, that's no good. It should be. Well, my screen's a bit too big. That's probably one of the problems. It's I'm working on a 43-inch screen here, so I'm seeing a large thing. What I might see if I can actually stop the sharing and come back and share just a window rather than trying to share my entire screen. So give me a chance to do
Yeah.
that. Okay, so I'll share that. Is that more, just give it a moment to come down, is that more viewable?
Yes, I think so.
Okay, thanks for that. Please interrupt me if anything gets out of hand like that. So thanks for that comment. So I'm going to open up the same idea, looking at a model of banking or financial commitments in terms of assets, liabilities, and equity. And if I now type reserves as an asset here, and then say loans, and I'm going to make this loans to firms just to have a simplified model where the only people who receive loans are firms. And I'm going to have
Can you
firms
zoom your screen? It's still very small.
Is it? Okay, that's, hang on. Can you see that table now more clearly or not?
Very hard to read. It's a very small bit of a much bigger gray screen.
That's strange because, again, I'll go back and I'll try sharing just that individual window. The wonders of
resolution there.
let's try that one. Can you see that?
Yes. Yes.
That's
Good.
not. Now you've got it.
Okay. Okay. Righto. Good. Okay. So I'm looking at firms having deposit accounts, workers having deposit accounts, and then the banking sector having bank equity. And I can start at, let's say there's $100 billion or whatever in reserves and $1 trillion in loans. And then there's say 800 billion in the workers' accounts and 100 billion, in the firm's accounts, 100 in the workers' accounts. Then Minsky is basically telling you must make all rows consistent. So assets minus liabilities minus equity must be zero. That's called the fundamental law of accounting. And so having done that, I've now got, as I'm saying, that's the initial amount of money in all these accounts. Well, if you have lend money, then I can have, say, lend to the firm sector. So the assets of the banking sector rise. Hang on a second, that's supposed to be over here. And that also means the liabilities rise because the money gets put into the firm's bank account. Then you have pay interest. So that is the money taken out of the firm's account and paid to the banks. And then the firms can repay their debt. So that's money that is taken out of the deposit account. And because it comes out of the deposit account, it's also written off from the loan. And then you have the worker, the main, since I've put the firm sector into one large lump here, unlike the disaggregation that Cara was doing earlier, then they have to, the only expense that the firms face outside the firm sector itself is paying wages. So they have wages to take money out of the firm's deposit account and pays it into the workers. And then you're going to have consumption by the workers. So that's going to be money that comes out of their accounts. I'll call it cons just to make it shorter than typing consumption from workers. And that, of course, gets paid to the firm sector. And then one more row, consumption by bankers. You know, they've got to buy some cocaine occasionally. So I have now consumption by bankers, and that's paid to the firm sector. Now, having done all that, I now think I most likely have to change the window, because if I go away from here, are you seeing anything on the screen at the moment or not?
Yes.
You're seeing the bank icon, or what are you seeing? Or the table still?
We can see your whole asset, liability, equity, and goes from flows down to consumed by bankers.
Okay, well, I'm going to go back and just bring up another window now and hope that it works at a reasonable scale. So what I've designed by doing that is this icon of a bank. Can you see a large bank building there?
Yes, it's
Good,
about
okay.
1/3 of the
Okay.
screen.
Okay, good. I'm just making it large so it can be seen easily. Now, what I've defined, if I actually go across to another window here, there's a set of equations here which are differential equations. So this is the sort of stuff you have to do in mathematical dynamic modeling. And of course, that freaks people out. Normally, if they haven't done mathematics themselves, that's the last thing they want to see. But simply by defining the table that I showed you earlier, and I'll now show it in a different view here. I hope you can see that. It's going to be a bit smaller. That's the same table I did a moment ago. And that's now defined the actual logic of financial flows. And I've got one mistake there. I've just noticed that I've got an uppercase O by accident. So I'm just going to fix that up. So Minsky spots errors for you and make sure that you get this final thing here saying assets minus liabilities minus equity equals 0. And then you know your logic is correct. Now to go from the stage of that's just a definition of what the financial flows are. That in itself is informative. And I'll show you what I want to focus upon in part of the rest of my talk. And that is that what does create money? And I'm talking in a general sense, not private sector, public sector. In general, what operations are necessary to create money? And the operations which are necessary to create money are ones which occur on both the asset on one hand and the liability or equity side of the private banking system. That's your simple way of saying, does an operation create money or not? So if something happens solely on the liability and equity side or the asset side, it doesn't create money. So here I have the banks, the firms paying interest to the banking sector. That is a transfer of money from the firm's deposit account to the bank's deposit equity account. There's no change in the liabilities. There's no change in the assets. There's no money creation. But when you have something like lending to firms, which I've got here, then lending increases the assets and increases the liability. It creates money. And equally, repayment is a negative on both asset and liability side. Repayment as a negative on the liability side reduces the liabilities. Repayment on the asset side reduces the assets. So that's effectively destroying money. So if you're going to have an operation which creates money, it must occur on both assets as one aspect of the balance sheet of the banks and liabilities or equity as the other. And that's a very useful general principle to clarify some disputes about aspects of money creation, particularly from MMT. Now, I won't try to define the model live on screen, but I'll show you the basics of it. That is just making placeholders, saying what are the financial transactions. And it means that my system of equations, which is a system now involving 5 different bank accounts, I know it's consistent because of this row, this column, pardon me, all the zeros there. If there wasn't a 0, it wouldn't be consistent. So I know that the logic of the overall system is correct, but I have to actually put that into define the flows themselves. If you take a look at the equation tab here, notice all the elements I've put in the table, consumption by bankers, consumption by workers, they're all zeros. So I haven't defined them yet. So I'll just quickly do that just to show you what's involved in building a model in Minsky. And you have to first of all copy the flow variables, and those are these things here, lend, interest, repay, they've all come across from the table, and copy the stock variables, which are the various accounts, loans, firms deposits, workers deposits, bank equity. So I'll just quickly define the most obvious thing to define here is interest payments. So if I have loans here and interest payments there, then obviously payments of interest are equal to the rate of interest times the outstanding level of loans. Now that bug I noticed, this is software which is always being developed. My programmers are working on it pretty much night and day because I've got one in Australia and the other in Spain. But at the moment, maybe on weekends they're not working on it, but it's being continuously developed, and every new development of software brings in bugs as well as advances. So what you can normally do, and I won't risk it here, is type your equations directly onto the screen. Actually, I'll be daring and I'll see if I can type a multiply code. Yes, I can. Great. Okay, so that bug has hit the latest version, but not the version before that. So that's now a multiply block.
Can you Can you zoom in just a little bit? A few people are at, oh, beautiful. Not that
Okay.
little smaller.
A little smaller. How's
All
that?
the participants in the top of your screen, if you click on view options, you can then click on zoom ratio and change it yourself.
Oh, okay. So I've actually...
Everybody else, the viewers can do that. So
Oh,
you
good.
can
Okay.
continue.
Thank you. Good. Okay, that's good advice. Okay, now what I've done is I've got loans, a multiplied block, and interest. Well, what I'm going to do is simply wire them together. And this is what you do. If I wire that here, and I now need to have an interest rate. So I'm just going to call this R standing for rate of interest on loans, and lowercase or subscript L. And that's now created a variable at the moment. I can convert it into a parameter. All that means is a parameter is something you actually have to set yourself on the program rather than being determined by other elements in the program. So I'll say this is, say, a 4% rate of interest with a maximum of 20% and a, whoops, that's a typing error, pardon me, and a minimum of, say, 1% and a step size of 1%. So using that, I can change the rate of interest during a simulation. And then I wire that up together. And now what I've created is an equation is interest paid by firms is equal to the loans outstanding by firms times the interest rate. And if I hit the calculate key, that'll give me that if there's $1 trillion worth of loans outstanding, then it's $40 billion per year interest that has to be paid. So you go through and do the same thing for all the other elements here, and you end up defining a simple model of the monetary system. And I'll now just quickly stop the sharing here and go across to a more complete model, which I'm looking for. That's the one I was buggering up a moment ago. So I better actually reload it, I suppose. I'll just do that, pardon me. And then I'll go back to sharing again. Okay. Okay, that one's, it's a bit like having a, waiting in the waiting room. You don't want to see some things which come up on screen. So I'll just quickly bring up, let's see, is that the one I want? Yeah. Okay, well, I'll live with it. I'll just have to, I'll do this, a bit of live fix up here. Pardon me, I'm working on a new book. So the new book has been taking my attention, and I didn't do a proper presentation here, so I'm a bit on the amateur side compared to what I normally do. So I'll just share this screen now. Again, tell me that you can see it reasonably on screen. I'll just actually move it around a bit and, okay, magnify. That's good. Thanks for that advice, by the way. Much appreciated. So that's the default view of the software. I can now change it so you see the view in terms of the double entry bookkeeping tables. I'll just make all of those look the same now. This, by the way, has only been possible for the last 2 weeks. So it's all these things are always being developed, and sometimes things go wrong when you bring in a new feature for the program. But this, what I've done with this particular model is taken the system I showed you beforehand, and I've then added in a capitalist class. So I've got loans to capitalists, firms having deposit accounts, capitalist deposit accounts, workers deposit accounts, and bank equity. And these are just using symbols just to make it shorter. The typical mathematician thing, you don't want to have long streams of text on your screen. So I've made this one small. But what this gives me is a model where I've defined all the flows, and I've defined the flows over here. I'll share this with Jamie to pass around to everybody else so you can see what these look like if you'd want to actually have a go at the program. And I very much appreciate people trying it out, because this is a way of understanding money creation. And if you're trying to persuade people about what is actually involved in banks creating money and so on, you can talk to you blue in the face with some people, you'll never get through to them. When you put it in a framework like this and they say, you say, do you accept this table accurately states what's going on? Do banks lend money to firms? Okay. The person answers yes. then you've got that row covered. Do they repay debt, etc., etc. So the table itself helps you clarify what's going on. Now, I'll just quickly simulate this model. What I've used as frequently in my modeling, I don't know if Caro does the same thing, perhaps he does, but I frequently use what are called time constants to simulate dynamic processes. And what a time constant is something dimensioned in time that gives you a way of interpreting how large a flow is compared to the stocks that flow is based upon. So if you imagine the amount of money that you have outstanding in a loan, and what would be, and banks are lending at a particular rate, the time constant tells you how long bank lending would take to double the amount of outstanding debt. If you look at the rate of repayment, that tells you how long the repayment would take to drive the debt down to zero. So you can say, well, what's a reasonable number for both of those? Well, if you have a fairly tame financial sector, then maybe it might take, say, 7 years to double all the loans. So you can set that time constant up here. And then how long would it take to repay all the debt? Maybe 9 years. Well, those are your time constants. Then you then play what the interactions are like. So I'll start with them both on 9 in this model and just make it a bit larger so you can see the elements more clearly. And when you simulate, you see that with this, if the level of loan creation is the same as the level of repayment, you don't get any money created. But if you say, well, maybe let's say banks take 7 years to double the amount of outstanding debt rather than 9, you reduce that to 7, and you suddenly see your bank accounts and your incomes and so on reacting to that. And then if there's, for example, a repayment takes longer still, so you get even more of a boom. But then if you have people repaying debt more rapidly than banks are lending, you get a slump. So it's very easy to demonstrate financial dynamics using Minsky, and that's why I designed this software rather than using VinSim or the other programs, because I just was aware of, and Caro will appreciate this because he's actually done it, how very difficult it is to load this out accurately using flowcharts, and how if you make an error in a flowchart, you decide you want to redesign it, it's such a mess that most people give up. And I know that, for example, Positive Money in the UK was building a model of the financial sector in Stellar, which is another one of these flowchart programs. And I was speaking to the model saying, look, you're going to give up at some, I hate to tell you this, but you're going to give up at some point because you're going to realize you got something wrong, and trying to amend it is going to be exhausting and you'll give up. And that's exactly what they did. So what I want to now show is the final model of modern monetary theory. And I'll just actually see where we are here. That's the one I want to bring up. So I just hope I can spot that properly when I decide to share screen here. And so that is, now I'm looking through for the titles here. There we are, okay. So this is what I call one mathematical model of modern monetary operations. And I have to confess that the reason I've got the title, it's a perfect palindrome. That's a word that sounds the same whether you say it front, forwards or backwards, but this one even works from the middle. So I'm just being cute with the title here. So let's look at the banking sector, which is the biggest of these systems here. Oh, I've just made them, by double clicking, I actually managed to change the logic. Oh no, that's correct, okay. So I just want to now open the table to a way that I can edit it, and I'll just quickly change what I'm sharing so you see this screen as well. Rather a jumpy presentation here, but let's see how we do. Okay, so share that. Ah, that's the wrong one. Thank you. Pardon me. I'll go back and try to get the right one. I think show all windows. That's what it's not showing there. It's not showing the right one. Let's go down. I don't know that it's showing me the correct one here, so damn. Okay, I better go back and just take a look at the Minsky about start with the over. Okay, so we won't be able to explain it quite as well as I'd like to, but still. So what I have here is lending and repayment, as I showed you beforehand. What I'm now including is government operations as well. And again, to make it simple, I'm just saying that all the operations go on the firm sector. That is just for simplicity. You could actually include taxation on each of the sectors, but you'd get a mass more rows and it would be much, much harder to read. So this is what mathematicians call as a simplification without loss of generality, or W-log as they call it. So here's lending, creating money, repayment, destroying money. Here's taxation, destroying money, and spending, creating money. So the modern monetary theory argument, and I know this is going to annoy somebody in the audience, the modern monetary theory argument that the deficit itself creates money is correct. And this is what Kara is, those researchers also confirming, of course. If spending exceeds taxation, then you have an increase in the liability side of the banking sector and an increase in the asset side as well. So that's the first step. So the actual deficit creates money. Okay, you don't need to be borrowing it from somewhere else or selling bonds. It's the deficit itself that creates the money, just like lending in excessive repayments creates money by the banking sector. Then I have the government selling bonds. That's one of the other tables, but I'll come back to that. So this is the sale of bonds to the banking sector. And of course, to sell the bonds, the banks have to use their reserves. And that then means they swap reserves for bonds. Now that's an operation occurring solely on the asset side of the banking sector's ledger. So it doesn't involve any money creation. It's an asset swap. And it's financed, the reserves that are necessary to do it are created by the deficit itself. Now, of course, this is a mathematical model. Everything is happening at the same time in this system. I haven't got any time lags or time delays. But in the real world, it's quite possible for the government to estimate what it's likely to need for spending next year, estimate what its tax and spending levels are going to be, and then preemptively issue bonds before, after, or during. Okay, so the timing will be different in the real world, but the basic principle applies. The deficit itself creates the money that's needed to finance buying the bonds. So you're never going to run out of bonds. My favourite example of this is the spending during the Second World War. And in the case of the UK, the deficit in 1939-40 was 1940, I think it was 40% of GDP. In America in 42, your deficit was 30% of GDP. Now, people think the bonds were sold to finance it. No, the deficit created the money. The bonds simply covered that so that the central bank didn't have an overdraft account for the Treasury. And the sales of bonds, war bonds and stuff like that, didn't finance the war at all. It took money out of the non-military private sector and transferred it across, and basically reduced the spending on consumer goods and increased the amount of money, spending relative money on military. But let's just look through here as well. Equally, sales by the central bank do not create money. They are another asset swap. They take money they take bonds out of the ownership of the banks and give them reserves in return for those bonds. But because that's an operation occurring just on the asset side, again, no money creation occurs. There is money creation by the payment of interest on bonds. So if the banks have bonds, then this is the interest they get paid on the bonds they hold. That increases their equity and it also increases the reserves. So interest payments create money. And you can keep on going here. I've only shown a few operations. I can add further operations here as well. But you can build a coherent model of the whole monetary system. Now, what Minsky does as well, and I haven't explained how it does this, but it's quite straightforward. Once you've created a table like this, a single table, then you're going to have some you're going to have liabilities here, which are liabilities to the banking sector, but at the same time, they have to be assets of somebody else. So you've created a need to fill a hole in the logic of the program, saying, well, this is firms as a liability, whereas firms as an asset. So you simply create another table, which is click on this icon here, bring it down and put it on the canvas somewhere, open it up, and then look if you want to, I don't know if you can actually see this. Can you see a little window or not of the?
Yes. There's a little bank down in the bottom right.
Yeah, but you can't see. I've just made a table bigger. I don't think you can see that the way Zoom works. But I'll come back to that.
Yeah.
But okay, good. There are drop-down arrows there, and the drop-down arrow, when you click on it, goes looking for any liability which hasn't yet been made an asset for somebody else in the system. And if one exists, it shows you the list of unallocated liabilities. You click on that and all the operations are brought across for that particular liability to see it as an asset instead. So that's how I built this rather comprehensive view of the banking sector, central bank treasury, firms, capitalists and workers, by tying all this together. And then I defined the overall system. And I want to now just use this in anger, so to speak, and show what you can illustrate with it. So what I've got up here, I'll actually just make this, I'll just drag the screen around a bit and make those a bit larger so you can hopefully see the text. So S rate stands for spending rate and T rate stands for tax rate. And I've set these at 32.5% for spending, 32.5% of GDP and 30% for taxation, meaning there's a 2.5% of GDP deficit being run. Now, that's arbitrary. In the real world, of course, taxing and spending is so intimately caught up in other economic activities that you can't arbitrarily control them as I can do in this model, but it's just for an illustration purposes. But I can simulate this, and what you can see is what actually happens to the economy. I'll just go back to that being centered on full screen here. And what you have, I'll just keep it running here, is an increase in the debt of the government sector, which is the black line here, but a fall in the debt of the private sector as a proportion of GDP, because the government money creation is stimulating the economy and enabling the GDP to rise, so the debt ratio of the private sector falls. Then if you get a bunch of typical, well, I won't say typical Republicans, but typical deficit hawks coming along and saying, well, we're burdening our children, let's now run a taxation, increased taxation to pay for this, and you keep on going, and it's just reset itself, which is something I didn't want it to do. Let's go back and start again. Okay, with the deficit alone, and then while it's running, I'll change the tax rate. So what you have is a growing economy here. You can see GDP is rising and there's a positive growth rate for GDP of 6%. If I now increase the taxation, so taxation now exceeds spending, you have a declining economy. GDP starts to go down. It's still got some momentum here because of interest payments as it happens. But what this program lets you do, which you can't do in the real world, is separate out the influence of the government running a deficit versus the banks lending more than they get back in repayments. So you can look at the 1920s, for example, and we know in the 1920s that the Calvin Coolidge government ran a 1% of GDP surplus every year, pretty much for the whole of the 1920s, and was convinced that that was what was causing a fabulous boom, which we now call the Roaring Twenties, because every time they did it,
the depression of the 30s.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, yeah, that's right. What it did was, it was only working because at the same time as the government was running a 1% of GDP surplus, the private sector was running a 12% of GDP deficit by borrowing more from the banks than it was getting back in repayments. There was a huge increase in private debt. Then you get to the end of the 20s and bang, the government's still running a surplus, but the private sector goes into repaying debt or in a debt deflation, and bang, you have the Great Depression. So it's a way of teasing out and saying what actually caused each of these factors in a stylized model, which is still a very correct statement of the overall logic of the economy. And what I want to point out, I'll finish on this point and we'll come back and I'll take some questions as well, is that notice that this, in every table, there's an equity column. You can have multiple equity columns if you want. That's when you want to differentiate one type of equity from another. But in this model, overall, equity is a residual account. And when you look at the equity of the banking sector, it is the exact opposite of the equity of the non-banking sector. When you look at the equity of the government sector, it's the exact opposite of the equity of the non-government sector. And that's what's being done by all these equations here. I'm adding up the equities to see what the overall sum is. And it's rather hard to see that on your screens here, but that is 2.45 by 10 to the minus 15, or computer speak, that's computer speak. In real world, we call that 0. That's saying the equity of money users the current state of the simulation here is minus 38.8. The equity of the money makers, which is the government plus the banking sector, is 38.8. So you get this matching of equity. And one thing which I learned from building this model, and often I find I teach myself things about money by using Minsky, is that, well, two things. First of all, I used to, if people ask me, does government deficits create money? I used to say yes, to the extent that the deficit is financed by the central bank. I was wrong. Okay. That's not true, because over here, when I bring in the bond sales or bond purchases by the central bank, because that happens entirely on the asset side of the banking sector, it doesn't create money. It's an asset swap. And that's an argument Stephanie Kelton made in the deficit myth that was one of the motivations for building this model, and gee whiz, I find she's right. So my particular idea there was wrong. But what I also got out of it was this realization that when you're talking in terms of claims on other people or other institutions, not accrual now when you end up owning something and you can take it out of financial obligations, but when you've got an obligation on an asset, which is, and that's somebody else's obligation to you, the sum of all those is zero. So then you look at the banking sector, and for the banking sector, a bank can only continue operating if it has positive equity. So if the banking sector has positive equity, by definition, the remainder of the society has precisely the same negative equity. And then if you think about a pure credit economy, which is one of the fantasies Austrians go on about, that means that in a pure credit economy, everybody except the banks is in negative equity. Not everybody necessarily, the sum of everybody else is in negative equity. But that's one reason people speculate. So if you actually had a pure credit economy, you'd actually be encouraging speculation, because people think as they buy financial assets and they increase in value, then they give themselves a positive equity situation. So it's one of the reasons we get caught up in asset bubbles, the fact we end up with negative equity. Equally, people often, from the right, often think that government spending is a burden on future generations. In fact, government spending means the government ends up with a negative equity, which it can handle indefinitely, and creates positive equity for other people. So if you have the sort of deficits that were run back in the 50s and 60s, the private sector in general has positive equity, and nobody is particularly interested in speculation. You go to the stage after the Reagan emphasis upon cutting back government spending, and you end up pushing people into negative equity, and guess what they do? They start gambling on the stock market and real estate markets. So this is a way of getting a philosophical critique of the whole idea of a totally private money system. The final thing that I learned from building this model is that I thought that the negative equity would be worn by the central bank. Let's drag this out a bit. I'll grab the corner rather than grabbing the stretch arrow here. Okay. But I found overall the equity operations of the central bank left it with no change to its overall equity. The negative equity is borne by the Treasury. So here you can notice I've got Treasury equity is minus spend plus tax minus interest on bonds. So the Treasury ends up in negative equity. Now people talk about audit the Fed. Nobody thinks about auditing the Treasury, but in fact to maintain a positive net equity for the non-government sector, the Treasury has to run negative equity. And of course it can manage to do that because it can back its position with little things called rifles, rockets and nuclear bombs. Not that it, hasn't used them on its own people yet. I'm getting more and more worried about your country every day, Americans in the audience. But it's indefinitely got the capability to handle that negative equity. It's the entity that creates the monetary system in that sense. So it can handle the negative equity. The central bank remains neutral fundamentally. And therefore you have an equity analysis that says the best thing is for the government to run a deficit, to provide net positive equity for the rest of the economy, reduce the attractiveness of speculation, which is what we have to get caught in otherwise. And you can make this argument verbally, and that's what Stephanie Kelton's done in the deficit myth, but it's so easy for people to obfuscate. When you show them hard financial tables and hard numbers, I think it's harder to obfuscate. So I've got a long way to go in building this model. It's only the beginnings of one, but I think there's a few useful insights inside there. And it's the sort of thing which, if you're interested in money, then with a bit of work, you can build models in Minsky. And that's what I'd like people to do, because this enables us to have a debate where when you've got a framework shown, you actually have to discuss the framework. Okay? It sets the debating format. So I'll leave it there and take some questions.
Thank you, Dr. Keane. I think we have some people that have your model. Don't know if they are able to use it. Are you giving classes, or do you have modules where people can, download the model and play around with it? What is other people's possibilities, except maybe graduate students, to play around with this?
Well, that's I'll actually quickly share my screen again and show you where to download Minsky from. I'll share the entire screen if I can. Let's see if that's the entire screen. Okay. So let's bring up Chrome here, and I'll go to SourceForge. So anybody can go here. SourceForge Minsky is what's being brought up on screen. It's a bit larger as well. And all you have to do is click on that download button. And if you're adventurous, go to Files here and download one of the beta builds. There's a beta every week coming out, changing the programs. We have as you saw, a couple of bugs in the current version. The next release will address those bugs. So, but that's where you get the latest version. A lot of the features I've shown you here use features that are new in the development cycle of Minsky. So download it from there. In terms of tuition, I'm working on a book right now which will include a companion that teaches you how to use Minsky. I'll have a rough draft available in about a month. And then we've got funding from Friends Provident Foundation, which, if you know Friends, that's Society of Friends or Quakers. It's the outreach group of the Friends Provident insurance company in the UK. They gave us a grant of 200,000 UK pounds to develop Minsky for the last year and a half. And the final part of the funding will pay for this manual to be written. So once that's done, there'll be something you can actually use. In terms of getting a tutorial on how to use it, I'm going to be giving a course to students at University of Missouri, Kansas City, sometime in the next month or two, once all the election stuff dies down. And that'll be the first sort of hands-on screen. I'm not at a university anymore, so I don't actually take graduate students. But I may, now that I'm in Bangkok, I may well end up giving courses at Chulalongkorn University. So that'll be something that'll help with their government. But at the moment, it's still a work in progress.
Great. Well, we'll keep in contact to get, for those who are interested, to get that information out, if they want to bite into it. Stephen, how shall we do with questions? Do we have time? Steve, you have to unmute yourself.
Okay. Yep.
I think we have time for one question.
For one. Okay. Well, I have a few here.
And then more after the panel is over.
Yes. Well, Professor Keane might not be present at the panel.
It's midnight, so I'm going to be going to bed soon.
All right. Some of the things that come up, of course, are differences or overlaps with MMT. So I got one question is, can you show the destruction of money by taxation? So one of the things that some people are saying, like the Kelton model of that when people pay their taxes get destroyed, and when the government spends, basically new money is created. So the question is, can you show that somehow in your model that taxations or taxes are destroyed?
Yeah, that's being done in the table here. And like that's one of those things. Particularly, I know I read that when Warren Mosels, they tear up the dollar notes. I'm thinking, oh, what a load of crap, the emotional reaction to it. But when you think about how do you actually pay taxes, thinking particularly in terms of electronic transfers now, you authorize by doing your tax return, you authorize the tax authority to take your tax liability out of your bank account and transfer it to itself, so it appears. But what actually happens is they have a minus taxation here, which reduces the bank's liability of the taxes levied on the firm sector here, which comes a minus on the reserves. So that's destroying money. So in that sense, even though, you know, Warren's way of stating it was overblown and simplistic, or so it appeared, the reality is you have destroyed money by paying tax. And Cowrer's work there was very nice on showing the different elements of creating money, both government debt and private debt. But if you reduce the level of government debt, which you do by if the tax is used to pay off government debt, you're destroying money at the same time. And again, the general principle is that any operation which occurs on both the liability and the liability stroke equity and asset side of the private backing system's ledger will create or destroy money. So lending creates money, government spending creates money, repayment destroys money, taxation destroys money.
Could Professor Keene explain how his debt jubilee proposals would affect Minsky?
Yeah, quickly, the debt jubilee would be fundamentally a swapping of the loans and the reserves here. If you have a debt, I'll take a risk and I'll see if I can add that to the table. So just give me a moment to stop the sharing here, and I'll go back and then load the Godly table view of this, and then see if I can share that window. Hoping that's the right one. Let's see. Okay, so you can see that there. I can just add another row here and say, for example, Jubilee. I'll put that there just so I don't get a classification error turning up. Well, let's say it's money that's given to workers. That's the Jubilee. And that means reserves rise by the Jubilee. And now some of those workers are going to be in, it should be the firm sector. I'll just drag that across to the firm sector. Imagine the Jubilee is given to the firm sector. Then, let's say Jubilee payment, first of all, and then Jubilee debt cancellation. So that would then mean, say, well, you've got to repay part of your debt on the Jubilee basis, which is going to reduce the loans over here. And then others would have money left over. So there's your operation. First of all, you create money in this, I'm just using the firm sector here for simplicity, in the firm sector, which creates reserves. Then you require firms that are in debt to repay it using that money from the Jubilee. So you then end up reducing the amount of loans outstanding. Now, if one happens to be equal to the other, which is feasible, if all firms are in debt when they do it, then there's this operation is a positive, that's a negative, they cancel each other out. What's actually happening, therefore, is fundamentally an asset swap. You go from having debt-backed money to fiat-based money. So that's the basic idea.
Professor Keene, actually there are so many questions coming up that we probably have no time for that. But a suggestion was made maybe to collect them, refine them, and submit them to you afterwards, so you can take your time in giving something of a written response. I see you sighing, so we'll try to.
I'll do some of them, yeah. But
we'll try to be compassionate.
Well, and on that front, I might.
You're freezing up now, so we're not hearing you. And if the freeze up,
Actually, I'll do some automated compression and go back to. Oh, okay. I don't know.
yeah,
Is it
hold
frozen?
on, Professor King, you froze up, I think.
Okay.
Maybe on my screen or maybe in general. But go ahead.
Okay, can you? I hope you can hear me now. I've got a
Yes.
few hassles. Okay, so if you go to my Patreon page, most of my posts on Patreon are free access. My supporters there, as you can see, about 1,500, paying me pretty much my professorial salary, which is very nice. But I asked them early on, and they said they wanted to make my posts freely available rather than being restricted just to patrons. So if you go searching on this, I'll come over here and take a look at the tags that I use here, and one of them is MMT. And ultimately, it'll take a while, but ultimately Patreon will tell you these are posts that have been tagged with MMT, and one of them is the modern monetary paper. So let's come down and see if I can find that. There we are. One mathematical model of modern monetary operations. Click on that. And then there's the entire, this is the logical argument, much more detailed, of course, than I've given here today. Yeah. But down the way down the bottom, you will find that I've got the PDF of the presentation. So you can just download that PDF from there just by clicking it. It'll download to your computer. So my first resort is going to be saying, please check the PDF. If I find any question, which I know I've answered there, that'll be the answer I give.
Oh, okay. We will share all this information, of course, with all the participants to send them to your Patreon and your papers. Mm-hmm. Well, we're 10 to 11, so I bid you adieu and good night in Bangkok. Your screensaver looks really nice. So
it's not a screensaver.
Oh no, okay, it's real. Oh, that's even nicer. That's good. Professor King, thank you so very much. Too bad we didn't get into an in-depth discussion, but you know, one day down the line we might. And
thank you from everybody too.
Mm-hmm.
If this video is helpful, please hit the like button, subscribe for new video notifications. Please consider donating at monetary.org/donate. Don't forget to check us out on Twitter at AMI Monetary or on our website